Some lives unravel not with a crash, but with a single quiet moment that breaks the illusion. One minute you're the wife of a celebrated financier, the next you're clutching your cheek in a room full of strangers, while the man you once trusted becomes a headline. Caleb Whitaker was the kind of man tabloids loved to despise, charming, rich, and perpetually surrounded by controversy. But no one anticipated this particular scandal to explode in the midst of one of New York's most elite dining establishments, least of all with his pregnant wife sobbing in the spotlight. In just one heated instant, Caleb shattered more than an overpriced dinner plate when he delivered a harsh slap across Isabel's face. Witnesses froze, phones raised, capturing every angle of the betrayal. Within hours, the video went viral, dragging Caleb and the secrets he had spent years burying straight into public view. Caleb Whitaker prided himself on two things: his unmatched ability to seal any business deal and his carefully crafted public image. If you walked into the steel and glass high-rise that housed Whitaker Capital, you'd be greeted by beaming receptionists, sharply dressed assistants, and a framed portrait of Caleb himself, a picture that radiated both authority and allure. Behind the scenes, he maneuvered through complex financial negotiations with steely precision. He had clawed his way up from a modest upbringing, something he rarely mentioned, to become the city's most revered financial tycoon. His name was regularly splashed across the social columns, often beside photos of his sophisticated wife, Isabel Whitaker. Together, they looked every bit the image of a power couple. Her warm hazel eyes and elegantly swept hair radiated composure and refinement, qualities essential to her role as the wife of a millionaire financier in high society. But Isabel was more than ornamental. She held a master's degree in modern literature and curated programs at a major publishing nonprofit. Still, to the outside world, she appeared merely as a well-dressed accessory to Caleb's soaring ambitions. Caleb viewed himself as unstoppable, until recently. He had just learned Isabel was pregnant. It was news that, by traditional standards, should have filled him with joy. Instead, it landed like an unwanted interruption to the larger narrative of his life. Fatherhood meant cutting back on lavish cocktail hours, impromptu weekend escapes, and those risque dinner meetings that usually involved more than food. To make matters worse, the market had been shaky for the last 6 months. Rumors swirled that Wall Street was entering a downturn, and Caleb was beginning to feel the strain. But he refused to show weakness. He plowed forward with new investments, brushing off the caution of colleagues. He had built his empire. How could it possibly falter? Meanwhile, Isabel Whitaker stared at the ultrasound images tacked to the mirror of her vanity. Every morning, she was mesmerized by the tiny figure growing inside her. Yet beneath the wonder, a subtle dread lingered. Her marriage had once been rooted in mutual devotion. But in recent months, Caleb had grown remote. He'd come home later and later, miss key doctor's appointments, and occasionally display a flash of temper she had never seen in their earlier years. She confided in her closest friend, Madeline Prescott, who came from a wealthy family rooted in generations of oil money and spent her days balancing art galas and fundraising committees. Madeline would often say, "Men like Caleb are under tremendous pressure. You've got to be more patient." Isabel tried. She organized candlelit dinners, planned slow, cozy evenings by the fireplace, and even gently suggested couples therapy. But Caleb always dismissed her, sometimes with a cold shrug, other times with a flat refusal. To her, the pregnancy was a blessing, but to him, it seemed like an inconvenience he couldn't articulate. He grew distant whenever she brought up baby names or asked his opinion on nursery colors. Isabel started jotting down every tender gesture he offered, however rare, as if collecting priceless relics, desperate proof that the man she once loved was still there somewhere beneath the detachment. To make matters worse, whispers had started to circulate among the city's elite. There was talk of a mistress, some said. Others claimed to have seen Caleb in questionable company at late-night venues. Isabel clung to hope, trying to stay true to the vows they had exchanged. After all, this was the same man who had once surprised her with a last-minute trip to the Amalfi Coast, just to watch the sunset with her on her birthday. And yet, that familiar tightness in her stomach refused to fade. Something felt deeply wrong. Selena Moretti was everything a scandalous mistress could be. tall, magnetic, and brimming with ambition. Raised on the outskirts of Naples, she had clawed her way out of obscurity with sheer wit, striking beauty, and a relentless drive to escape her past. With no connections, she had arrived in the city and found work as a jazz singer in an upscale hotel lounge favored by the rich and powerful. That's where she first caught Caleb's attention. He was immediately captivated by her melodic accent and the mystery she embodied. As her voice lingered over the final line of a sultry ballad one night, Caleb found himself utterly taken. He approached with the confidence of a man used to always getting his way. Selena knew who he was instantly. The tabloids were full of stories about Caleb Whitaker, the financial genius who turned obscure investments into golden empires. She played coy, acting unaware of his reputation or wealth, though she knew exactly what she was doing. It wasn't long before their meetings turned into secret rendezvous at private suites in luxury hotels. To Caleb, Selena reignited something he felt had long vanished from his marriage. She was daring, intoxicating, and fed the part of his ego that craved attention and praise. She'd whisper in his ear about his brilliance, how unstoppable he was, and how lucky she felt just to be near him. It filled a void he had never acknowledged existed. To Selena, Caleb was a gateway, not just to comfort but to influence and power. She played the long game, pretending to be naive about his personal life while secretly tracking his every move online. In her mind, if his marriage was crumbling, it wasn't her responsibility. She was simply the prize he deserved. She understood exactly what was at stake. If she played her cards right, Selena could trade late-night lounge performances for a life of stability, even luxury. She acted oblivious to Caleb's personal circumstances, although she followed every update through his online footprint. In her mind, if Caleb was unhappy in his marriage, that was his burden, not hers. She was the reward. He deserved the thrill. It all began to unravel during what started as an extravagant evening at L'Or Rouge, the city's most prestigious French restaurant. Famed for its glittering chandeliers, velvet-lined walls, and a menu that left even the most refined diners breathless, it was nearly impossible to get a reservation. Caleb, of course, had connections. He knew the owner and had reserved his favorite table, a plush corner spot veiled in gold and deep red curtains that provided both exclusivity and distinction. He arrived with Selena on his arm, and heads turned instantly. She wore a jade silk gown that shimmered with each movement, hugging her frame effortlessly, while Caleb looked dashing in his midnight blue tuxedo. The staff practically tripped over themselves in their eagerness to please. The sommelier arrived quickly with a rare bottle of Chateau Margaux 1982, pre-ordered at a price that could make anyone wince. Selena basked in the attention, laughing softly at Caleb's every ordinary comment, her lashes fluttering as if he were quoting Shakespeare. But she had no idea. Someone had recognized them. A quiet message was sent. Within minutes, whispers began to spread across the upper crust of the city's elite social circles. Meanwhile, Isabel sat at home, gently rubbing her growing belly, trying to soothe the sinking feeling that had taken root. Again, she wondered why Caleb hadn't come home. She had called his office more than once, each time met with a polite assistant's apologetic tone. "Mr. Whitaker is still in a meeting." Then her phone lit up. A message from a distant acquaintance flashed on the screen. "You need to see this." Attached was a grainy photo of Caleb, seated across from another woman at L'Or Rouge. Isabel's world spun, fueled by heartbreak, adrenaline, and a new surge of courage she hadn't known she possessed. She made a decision. She grabbed her coat and hailed a ride, every fiber in her telling her to stay put, but her heart pushing her forward. She had to know for sure. As the car approached the restaurant, tears threatened to fall. She clutched her phone to her chest like a lifeline. Upon arrival, her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the sound of the host asking for her name. She spotted him almost instantly through the ambient golden light of the restaurant. He was laughing, his face turned toward Selena, completely absorbed. For a moment, Isabel couldn't breathe. The sight felt surreal, like a nightmare that refused to release her. Pushed forward by raw emotion, she slipped past the staff unnoticed and came to a trembling halt at the edge of their table. Her presence was so unexpected, Caleb didn't register it at first. But Selena looked up and froze. The smug amusement on her face vanished, replaced by a flash of startled alarm. Caleb finally noticed. His laughter stopped, and a tense silence fell over their private corner of the restaurant. By now, the surrounding tables had taken notice. Diners leaned forward subtly, craning to see what had interrupted the otherwise serene atmosphere. Caleb's voice cut through the stillness. "Isabel? What are you doing here?" Isabel struggled to find her voice. Her throat felt parched, like every word scraped against sandpaper. "So? This is what you do on your late nights?" Before Caleb could respond, Selena made a motion to rise, but one sharp look from Isabel rooted her back in her seat. Isabel didn't see the restaurant staff slowly inching closer, nor the scattered camera phones now lifted by intrigued patrons. Her entire world narrowed to the man sitting in front of her, the one whose face now showed more irritation than shame. Seeing the tension thicken, the maître d' approached delicately. "Madame, if there's a—" "Stay out of this," Caleb snapped, eyes locked on Isabel. The room felt electric with suspense, a blend of dread and voyeuristic anticipation gripping the guests. Isabel's hands trembled, not with fear, but from a volatile mix of betrayal and anguish. She couldn't hold it in any longer, and no one could have foreseen just how fast things would spiral. Her voice was barely above a whisper, laced with pain. "How could you?" "I'm pregnant, Caleb. I'm carrying your child." The final word cracked as it left her lips. Caleb's eyes darted around the room, fully aware of the dozens of eyes now glued to the unfolding scene. The carefully manufactured image he had built, one of integrity, elegance, and control, was beginning to crumble. To him, Isabel had broken the unspoken rule. Personal scandals belonged behind closed doors. But in confronting him here, in front of everyone, she had ripped the curtain wide open and shattered the illusion he had spent years perfecting. Held together only by pride, Caleb's temper snapped. In a single reckless moment, he raised his hand and struck Isabel across the face. The sharp smack of his palm against her cheek reverberated through the hushed restaurant, stunning everyone into silence. Isabel staggered back, her hand flying to her stinging cheek, her eyes wide with disbelief and hurt. Selena gasped. A few diners cried out in alarm. One or two even made a move to intervene. But it was already too late. The damage was done. As Isabel steadied herself, the full weight of the moment crashed down. She was pregnant, exposed, and had just been assaulted by the very man she once believed would be her protector. Then came the chaos. Concerned guests surged toward her. Some held up their phones, recording. A few women tried to comfort Isabel, while others began yelling at Caleb, calling him out in fury. Security threatened to call the police. But Caleb, thanks to his status and connections, somehow slipped through the initial fallout. He stood frozen, as though his mind hadn't caught up with what he'd just done. Selena tugged urgently at his sleeve, whispering desperately for him to leave before law enforcement arrived. Isabel, tears running freely down her face, could barely breathe. Her cheek blazed with pain, and her entire world seemed to have crumbled with that one brutal slap. The viral firestorm began before the night even ended. Videos, captured from multiple angles, spread across social media like wildfire. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. By morning, Caleb Whitaker was trending, hashtags exploding, justice for Isabel, stop domestic violence, Whitaker exposed. The backlash was swift and unrelenting. Even people who had never heard of Caleb before were condemning him with fiery outrage. By sunrise, every major local news outlet was airing the footage. Cynthia Rose, a respected morning anchor, opened her broadcast with the scandal. Experts weighed in. Psychologists analyzed domestic abuse dynamics. Legal commentators speculated about potential criminal charges. Financial experts debated whether Whitaker Capital could survive the blow. If anyone had believed Caleb's reputation could weather the controversy, the sheer avalanche of condemnation silenced that hope. Isabel, meanwhile, had spent a sleepless night at Madeline's home, but peace was nowhere to be found. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages pouring in with condolences, legal advice, and press inquiries. Outside Madeline's gates, paparazzi had already gathered, lenses aimed and waiting. To Isabel, it felt surreal. Her deepest personal trauma was now a national headline. Caleb awoke to silence. The mansion, once filled with comfort and control, now echoed with emptiness. News vans lined the curb outside. Every attempt he made to reach Isabel was met with nothing but silence. Even Selena tried calling him several times, her voicemails panicked and urgent, but Caleb didn't answer. His PR team scrambled to take control of the crisis, urging him to release a public apology and show genuine remorse. But Caleb, too proud and perhaps still too stunned, refused to listen. He believed he could weather this storm like he had others before. But this time was different. That same afternoon, Caleb received what he had been dreading, an official court summons. He was to appear the next morning. This was no longer just a PR disaster or trending scandal. It was now a legal matter. The charge? Assault on his pregnant wife. The seriousness of the offense was enough for the district attorney's office to act without delay. Benjamin Klein, a seasoned high-profile attorney on Caleb's payroll, rushed to the Whitaker estate as soon as the news broke. He had handled plenty of elite, high-society cases before, but even he looked tense as he stood in the gleaming marble foyer. He didn't mince words. "The footage is everywhere. This isn't a rumor we can bury. You need to show remorse, real remorse when you're in court. Cooperate fully." Caleb bristled. "I built this empire," he snapped, pacing across the floor. "One mistake doesn't give everyone the right to tear me down. Isabel ambushed me. She came there to cause a scene." Klein's face tightened. "Do you hear yourself right now? That is not a defense. You hit your pregnant wife. The public outrage alone is enough to sink you if we don't handle this very, very carefully." He pushed again for a public apology, something heartfelt, possibly even a quiet settlement. Anything to prevent a prolonged and ugly criminal trial. Caleb, reluctant but cornered, eventually agreed to follow Klein's lead. But he refused to see Isabel, refused to apologize directly. Pride and fury clouded every thought, making him deaf to reason. His mind churned with bitterness. He blamed Isabel, the restaurant guests who recorded him, even Selena, for simply being there, for sparking the whole catastrophe. While Caleb began crafting a legal strategy, Isabel faced a storm of her own, one far deeper and more personal. She remained in Madeline's guest room, caught in a haze of grief, shame, and disbelief. Her cheek still bore the remnants of the bruise. Every glimpse in the mirror struck her like a blow. And when she placed her hand gently over her belly, the ache deepened. She wasn't just afraid for herself, she was terrified for the future of the child growing inside her. Through the door, Madeline tried everything. Warm tea, soft piano music, soothing encouragement. Isabel appreciated it all, but none of it pierced the numbness. She felt trapped, as if the world had shifted into a nightmare from which there was no escape. She never asked for any of this. The barrage of phone calls from advocacy groups, attorneys, and reporters only deepened the chaos. Some urged her to press charges and speak out. Others warned her to stay quiet, reminding her that Caleb was a powerful man capable of retaliation. Even her parents, who lived several states away, left her voicemails pleading for her to come home, far from the media frenzy. Eventually, Isabel let Madeline put her in contact with a legal advocate named Jessica Morales, a seasoned expert in domestic violence cases. Jessica arrived at Madeline's home with a calm, grounded energy that cut through the surrounding turmoil. She explained Isabel's legal rights and options, from protective orders to the possibility of a civil lawsuit. Isabel listened silently, her thoughts drifting to the earliest days of her relationship with Caleb, their honeymoon in Portugal, the long evenings spent planning their future, the shared joy the night they decided to start a family. Each memory now felt like a broken shard of something once whole. Beautiful, precious, now painful. But something had shifted inside her. A quiet determination began to grow. She was no longer just a woman wronged. She was a mother. And she had a responsibility to protect herself and the life she carried inside her, even if it meant dragging the man she once adored into court. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with commotion. Journalists, photographers, and spectators filled the steps and sidewalks. Barricades lined the approach to the building's main entrance as camera crews scrambled for position. When Caleb pulled up in a sleek black sedan, he was instantly surrounded. Flashbulbs lit up his expressionless face. Wearing a sharp charcoal suit and dark sunglasses, he looked untouched by the chaos, untouchable even. But his calm was a mask. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than expected for such a high-profile proceeding. Wooden benches were packed with members of the press and curious onlookers. Isabel sat at the prosecution's table beside Jessica Morales. She looked fragile, pale, her eyes low, but her posture held a quiet strength. Caleb barely looked at her as he took his place beside his lawyer, Benjamin Klein. Presiding over the case was Judge Margaret Kingsley, a sharp-minded jurist with little patience for dramatics. She addressed the defense, who quickly entered a plea of not guilty. Then came the charges: felony assault and battery against a pregnant spouse. The words rang through the silent courtroom. Prosecutor James Underwood wasted no time. He queued up the now infamous video evidence. The room fell still as the footage played. There it was, unmistakable. Caleb's hand striking Isabel's face with undeniable force. The impact on Isabel's cheek played across the courtroom screen. Her face twisted in pain, gasps audible in the background of the restaurant footage. Caleb swallowed, his throat visibly tight, though his face remained unreadable. His attorney argued that it had been a one-time incident, brought on by extreme emotional strain, completely out of character for a man known for his philanthropy and civic involvement. The prosecution swiftly countered. Emotional stress never justified violence, especially when the victim was carrying an unborn child. By the end of the hearing, one thing was clear. This wouldn't be resolved quickly. A trial was scheduled for several weeks later. The atmosphere in the courtroom buzzed with tension, ready to snap at any moment. In the days that followed, Selina Moretti found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. She had imagined Caleb would lean on her for comfort, perhaps whisk her away to some discreet luxury retreat, shielding her from the media chaos. Instead, he began ignoring her calls. The few times they did speak, his tone was sharp, irritable, as if she were now just another problem instead of his passionate escape. Selina had her own mounting problems. Paparazzi were now lurking outside the luxury apartment Caleb had secured for her. Her name started popping up in tabloid headlines. The other woman, Selina Moretti, breaks her silence, even though she hadn't spoken to a single outlet. Still, the offers rolled in. Trashy talk shows, sensational magazines. Everyone wanted her side of the story. Selina, ever the survivor, started to see the scandal as an opportunity. If Caleb was going to freeze her out, maybe she could benefit in her own way. Yet beneath her growing desire to capitalize on the moment, there was a flicker of something unexpected: guilt. She hadn't expected things to go this far. Yes, she had fantasized about replacing Isabel, but she'd never imagined Caleb would lash out with violence. Watching him strike a pregnant woman had shaken her. That evening, alone on her leather couch, she did something impulsive. She sent a short, anonymous text. "I'm sorry for what happened. I never wanted it to come to this." Moments later, she blocked the number. She wasn't sure why she'd even done it. That night, Selina sat wide awake, staring out at the city skyline. She had spent her whole life climbing, scraping for a better life, convinced the end always justified the means. But as the lights blinked across the glass towers outside, a sobering realization crept in. She was teetering on a ledge, just one misstep away from losing everything she'd fought for. Caleb Whitaker's PR team had never encountered a crisis of this scale. They were used to portraying him as a philanthropic executive, the kind of man who hosted black-tie galas for children's hospitals, funded scholarship programs, and spearheaded urban renewal projects. But the footage of him striking Isabel was unspinnable. The backlash was immediate and unforgiving. Major business partners began to pull away, and stock in Whitaker Capital plummeted. Shareholders panicked, and whispers from the board of directors suggested Caleb might no longer be fit to lead the company. Unwilling to accept defeat, Caleb convened a closed-door meeting in his penthouse office suite. The space, lined with carefully curated contemporary art, was meant to project power and taste, but today, it did nothing to soothe the tension thickening in the room. The board members sat stiffly around a gleaming conference table, their expressions wary and tight-lipped. Caleb stood at the head, hands clasped behind his back, trying to project calm. "We need to control the narrative," he insisted. "I've directed my attorneys to initiate settlement discussions with Isabel. If she agrees, we can handle this quietly." But one of the senior board members, Gerald Lanning, cut him off. "With all due respect, Caleb, you hit your pregnant wife on camera. There's no narrative to control, and if we don't make a clean break, this company could go under." A murmur of agreement swept through the room. Caleb's jaw clenched. He continued to argue that the scandal would pass, that if they stayed unified, they could ride it out. But the skepticism on the directors' faces was impossible to miss. Out in the corridors, employees whispered nervously, unsure if they'd still be employed by the end of the quarter. That evening, Caleb retreated to his private study, the city lights sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. A tumbler of vintage scotch in his hand, he stared at his reflection in the glass. He barely recognized the man looking back. His empire was crumbling, and for the first time, he didn't know how to stop it. As Caleb's world unraveled, those closest to him made their choices. A few longtime allies stayed close, offering discreet sympathy and legal advice. But most retreated, shielding themselves from the fallout. Invitations to elite parties dried up. Charity galas quietly struck his name from their guest lists. The same people who once chased after him now crossed the street to avoid him. Isabel, meanwhile, experienced her own shift. Friends who once admired her social status now reached out with warmth and sincerity, some offering legal resources, others sharing tips on single parenting or recommending therapists. Through it all, Madeline remained her anchor, fending off journalists, shielding her from flashing cameras, and standing guard against anyone with an agenda. And the press? They devoured every detail. Each day brought another exposé, headline, or commentary, dissecting the collapse of Caleb and Isabel Whitaker's gilded world. The press began digging deeper into Caleb Whitaker's financial records, uncovering shady partnerships and a trail of unfinished development projects. Speculative reports suggested that Whitaker Capital teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Journalists stationed themselves outside Madeline's quiet suburban home, their telephoto lenses aimed at the driveway. Whenever Isabel stepped outside for a doctor's appointment or just to take a short walk, the camera shutters clicked relentlessly. Caleb was furious about the media intrusion, even though he had forfeited any moral high ground. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he turned to Benjamin Klein and asked, "Is there any chance Isabel might drop the charges?" Klein's response was blunt. "She's moving forward. The DA has more than enough evidence. If this goes to trial, you're facing jail time, especially after hitting a pregnant woman." For the first time, true fear crept into Caleb's chest. He had always believed he could control the narrative, his image, his company, even the people around him. But now everything was unraveling, and all he could do was stand by and watch the collapse. Meanwhile, Isabel's days were filled with medical appointments and legal meetings. Her baby remained her central focus, each ultrasound offering a mix of relief and fresh concern. Could the child feel the stress pulsing through her? She tried to calm her mind through prenatal yoga, as recommended by her therapist. The yoga offered moments of peace, but the impending trial kept her constantly on edge. Dr. Anita Green, her therapist, gently urged her to process not just the physical assault, but the years of emotional neglect and psychological harm. In one particularly painful session, Isabel broke down. She described the countless nights she had waited for Caleb to come home, only to be met with apathy or disdain. She realized that the slap at L'Or Rouge was only the surface, a symptom of something far deeper and darker. That insight stirred something in her, fury and fear. Caleb's legal team tried every tactic: proposals for quiet reconciliation, large financial settlements, suggestions of coordinated public statements citing marital difficulties. But Isabel rejected them all. She wasn't the same woman who once bent over backward to keep the peace. She had changed. The baby had changed her. Now she had clarity and purpose. Late at night, she lay awake in Madeline's guest bed, the memory of the slap replaying over and over. Caleb's eyes filled with anger, the burn on her cheek, the stunned silence of the restaurant. It was the moment she realized just how fragile her life and her child's truly was. She had once loved Caleb Whitaker deeply, but love wasn't an excuse, not anymore. In that quiet darkness, Isabel made a promise to herself. She would see this through, no matter how long the road ahead. After consulting with her own attorney, Selena reluctantly agreed to comply with the prosecution's subpoena. The court of public opinion, however, was far less patient. Tabloids branded her the homewrecker, the femme fatale who seduced Caleb away from his marriage. Morning talk shows debated whether she was a villain or just another pawn in a powerful man's game. Selena found the spotlight both intoxicating and terrifying. Her once private life had become gossip column material, picked apart by strangers, judged without mercy. Inside Whitaker Capital, the board of directors held closed-door emergency meetings, without Caleb present. Rumors swirled of an internal vote to strip him of his CEO title. Whenever those whispers reached his ears, Caleb seethed. He felt betrayed by the very people whose fortunes he had helped build. Still, he held on to the hope that the trial might portray the incident as a rare misstep, enough, perhaps, to salvage a piece of his legacy. But in his quietest moments, he wondered whether the image of Caleb Whitaker, untouchable and invincible, was finally breaking for good. In the middle of this storm, Isabel received an unexpected show of support. A local nonprofit called Women First, an organization that advocated for domestic violence survivors, reached out, led by its fearless founder, activist Sarah Hernandez. They offered Isabel therapy services, legal assistance, and even personal security should she ever feel unsafe. Though hesitant to accept outside help, Isabel soon discovered a comforting sense of strength and community in their outreach. Around the same time, Caleb made an uncharacteristic gesture. A bouquet of white roses arrived at Madeline's home, accompanied by a handwritten note, "For the sake of our child, let's find peace." Isabel didn't respond. She handed the letter to her attorney, who added it to their growing stack of communications. Whether it was a genuine attempt at reconciliation or a calculated legal maneuver, she couldn't be sure. Meanwhile, a former employee of Whitaker Capital came forward. His name was Marcus Lee, and he shared a sworn statement alleging that Caleb had once verbally berated him during a closed-door meeting. He described Caleb as domineering and emotionally volatile, prone to fits of rage whenever his authority was questioned. Though unrelated directly to the assault on Isabel, Marcus's testimony painted a troubling picture of a man whose charisma masked a deeper cruelty. Isabel began to question everything. Had she ever truly known Caleb? Or had she simply fallen for the illusion, the ambition, the charm, the life he promised? The thought didn't fill her with sadness anymore. It filled her with resolve. She wasn't just seeking peace, she was seeking justice. Isabel began to realize that this trial was about more than just a single act of violence. It was about confronting a pattern of abuse and holding Caleb accountable for all of it. Late at night, she poured her thoughts into her journal. "I'm not just fighting for me. I'm fighting for every woman silenced by fear, every child who deserves a safe, loving home, and the kind of future I want my baby to grow up in." The morning of the trial arrived like a storm. Before the courthouse doors even opened, the steps were flooded with reporters. Their breath clouded in the early morning chill, lenses ready, microphones extended. News vans lined the curb like an army preparing for war, antennas rising skyward. Inside, every seat was filled. Attorneys, media personnel, court employees, and a handful of quiet observers there to witness the fall of a once untouchable man. Isabel sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a modest navy dress and little makeup. She didn't need embellishment. The bruise on her face had faded, but its memory remained raw beneath her skin. Jessica Morales sat beside her, focused, composed, and resolute. Across the aisle, Caleb entered the courtroom flanked by Benjamin Klein and a second attorney. His suit was immaculate, his hair precisely combed, but he looked different, thinner, tense. The set of his jaw was harder, and his eyes had lost their old spark. For weeks, the media had shown his unraveling. But now, under oath, there would be no chance to edit the footage. Only the truth would remain. Judge Margaret Kingsley entered, and the entire courtroom rose. She cast a deliberate, measured look across the room before giving a simple nod. "Let's begin." Prosecutor James Underwood stepped forward to deliver his opening remarks. His voice rang with precision. "This case isn't about real estate. It's not about charity work or celebrity status. It's about a woman, his wife, struck in public while pregnant. It's about a man who believed his wealth could shield him from consequences." He let the words settle in the air like stone dropping into still water. When Klein took the floor, his tone was grave. "Mr. Whitaker is not a monster. He is a man who cracked under extraordinary pressure. And yes, he made a terrible mistake. We will demonstrate that this was an isolated incident, Klein continued. Not part of a pattern, a lapse of judgment, not an act of cruelty. But the true turning point came when Isabel was called to the witness stand. She rose slowly, the sound of her heels echoing in the wood-paneled chamber. At the stand, she placed her hand on the Bible, swore her oath, and sat down, clutching a tissue quietly in her lap. Underwood began carefully, walking her through the early days. The marriage, the pregnancy, and the night, everything unraveled. I walked into the restaurant, Isabel said, her voice low but composed, and I saw my husband laughing with another woman. She paused, taking a breath. I felt humiliated, but more than that, I was scared. Scared because, when I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He hit me. Her voice trembled as she blinked back tears. It wasn't just the slap, she continued. It was the look in his eyes, like I was the one to blame, like I deserved it. The courtroom was silent. Jurors remained still. Some leaned forward with empathy. Others took notes, their pens scratching lightly against paper. When it came time for cross-examination, Klein approached with caution. Mrs. Whitaker, he began gently, would you say your marriage had its challenges prior to that night? Isabel nodded. All marriages do, but challenges don't justify violence. He pressed further. You showed up at the restaurant, uninvited, emotional, upset. Could things have escalated too quickly? Isabel's gaze sharpened. He didn't hesitate. That wasn't escalation. That was a choice. A heavy silence followed. Even Klein backed off, sensing he'd come too close to alienating the jury. As court adjourned for the day, Madeline met Isabel in the hallway, wrapping her in a quiet embrace. You did it, she whispered. You told the truth. Outside, reporters leaned over barricades, microphones pointed forward. But Isabel didn't stop. She kept her eyes locked on the doors ahead. She hadn't won justice yet, but she had walked in with truth. And that was the first step in taking her story back. The second day of trial began under a slate-gray sky. A heavy air of tension wrapped around the courthouse like fog. Cameras flanked the marble steps, commentators speculating about the witness expected next. Selina Moretti. She arrived in a dark sedan, shielded by tinted windows. Gone were the bold fashion statements and flirtatious charm. Today she wore a simple black dress with long sleeves, her hair pulled into a precise bun. The look was intentional, measured, and subdued. She entered through a side entrance, trailed by court staff, though not before a few keen photographers managed to capture a glimpse of her profile. Inside, all eyes turned as she took her seat. The atmosphere was charged as Selina Moretti walked slowly down the center aisle toward the witness stand. Isabel kept her gaze focused ahead, her jaw tense. Beside her, Madeline reached over and gave her hand a quiet, steady squeeze. Across the courtroom, Caleb shifted in his chair, his expression unreadable. Prosecutor James Underwood rose. Miss Moretti, thank you for being here today, he began softly. Could you tell the court how you first met Mr. Whitaker? Selina's voice was calm and measured. We met at the Grand Astoria Hotel. I was performing at the piano lounge. He came up to me after my set. And when did your relationship become romantic? Underwood asked. She hesitated. A few weeks later, he told me he was unhappy in his marriage. I believed him. A low murmur swept through the gallery. Underwood continued. Can you describe Mr. Whitaker's behavior during your time together? He was intense, subtle in how he liked to stay in control, but also charismatic. He'd surprise me with extravagant dinners, designer gifts. He knew how to make you feel seen. But when something didn't go his way, his temper surfaced. She glanced briefly at Caleb. Especially that night at L'Or Rouge. Underwood nodded. Can you tell us what you saw? Selina drew in a deep breath. He was already tense before Isabel arrived. He said awful things about her, called her names, said she was always on him about the baby. Then she appeared, and he panicked. She paused. But what shocked me most was how fast it happened. 1 second he was glaring, and the next he struck her. No hesitation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Caleb's face hardened, his jaw clenched. Benjamin Klein rose for cross-examination. Miss Moretti, he said smoothly, how long have you known the prosecution intended to call you? A few weeks, she replied. During that time, did you speak to any media outlets? No. Did you consider selling your story? No, she said, a sharper edge to her tone now. But you are aware your name is trending online? The mistress who brought down Caleb Whitaker. That has value, doesn't it? Selina didn't blink. I'm not here for value. I'm here for truth. Klein narrowed his eyes. Is it true you continued seeing Mr. Whitaker even after knowing he was married? Yes, she said clearly. But I never thought I'd witness violence. That changed everything. There was a pause. Klein held her gaze for a moment longer before backing away, sensing the jury had already made up their minds. Selina had done more than give testimony. She had delivered impact. Selina's testimony had deepened the prosecution's portrayal of Caleb, not as a man who simply lost his temper, but as someone whose fury simmered just beneath a polished surface. Next on the stand was Marcus Lee, the former Whitaker Capital employee. A man in his early 30s, Marcus spoke with nervous conviction. He described a closed-door meeting where Caleb had erupted over a minor clerical oversight. It was just a paperwork error, Marcus explained. But he screamed at me, told me I'd never work in this industry again. I quit that day and never looked back. Though his testimony wasn't directly tied to Isabel's assault, it painted a clearer picture. Caleb Whitaker was a man who weaponized his power and privilege, until now. By the end of the second day, the prosecution had done more than prove a singular violent act. They had established a disturbing pattern, an insulated man who used charm and influence to shield himself from consequences. As the judge adjourned for the evening, Isabel glanced across the courtroom and, just for a moment, met Selina's eyes. There was no tension in the exchange, no resentment. Just a quiet recognition of shared trauma. By the third day, the courtroom felt like a wound stretched tight. The prosecution's case was nearly complete. Isabel's emotional testimony, Selina's damning observations, Marcus's glimpse behind the curtain of power. Now it was the defense's turn, and they were left with one gamble. Caleb would take the stand. Benjamin Klein wasn't fully comfortable with the move, but Caleb had insisted. He believed his voice, his narrative, could win them sympathy. He had always known how to control a room, and he believed this jury would be no different. The courtroom fell silent as Caleb stood, straightened his jacket, and made his way to the witness box. He took a deep breath as the judge gave a nod. You may proceed. I grew up with nothing, Caleb began, his eyes drifting toward the jury. A one-bedroom apartment, a single mother who worked 2 jobs. I built everything I have, brick by brick. His voice was calm, every word delivered with precision. I've built homes, created jobs, I've donated to hospitals, mentored young entrepreneurs. My life hasn't just been about wealth, it's been about making a difference. He paused. But with success comes pressure. Immense pressure. This past year has been the hardest of my life. Corporate backstabbing, financial collapse. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't thinking straight. Another pause. That night, I broke. I snapped. He swallowed hard. I never meant to hurt Isabel. It was a moment of weakness. One I regret with everything I am. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Some jurors leaned forward, expressions softening. Others remained impassive, arms crossed, eyes wary. Then came the cross-examination. Prosecutor James Underwood rose, his tone clipped and focused. Mr. Whitaker, he began, you described your actions as a moment of weakness. Tell me, do you believe pressure justifies striking your pregnant wife? Caleb tensed. I didn't say it justified it. I said, it explains it. Underwood's eyes narrowed. You were calm enough to order a rare vintage bottle of wine, composed enough to laugh with your mistress, to pose for photos. But when your wife arrived, unexpected, yes, you lost control? Caleb's jaw tightened. It wasn't just her showing up. It was the scene she caused. She was confronting you, Underwood cut in, not for a misunderstanding, but for betraying your vows while she carried your child. Isn't it true, Mr. Whitaker, that you didn't strike her out of stress, but because she shattered your illusion of control? Objection, Klein interjected. Overruled, Judge Kingsley said calmly. Caleb faltered. I felt cornered. Underwood took a step closer. His voice was steady but sharp. Do you understand the danger you posed that night? Not just to Isabel, but to your unborn child? If she had fallen, hit her head, lost the baby, would it still have been a lapse in judgment? The room held its breath. Caleb's throat bobbed. Of course not. I regret it. Regret doesn't erase action, Underwood replied coldly, especially when that action is a violent assault. Klein's face tightened at the defense table. The carefully controlled narrative was falling apart under the prosecution's scrutiny. Caleb returned to his seat, visibly shaken. He leaned toward Klein, whispering something urgent, but his attorney said nothing. The silence was damning. In a last-ditch effort to sway opinion, the defense played a slideshow of Caleb's charitable contributions, ribbon cuttings, fundraisers, oversized donation checks to hospitals. But to the jury, it felt disconnected. Manufactured, hollow. Isabel sat in silence, fingers resting gently on her rounded belly. The man smiling in those photos, the supposed philanthropist, wasn't the man who struck her. He wasn't the man who had withdrawn from her emotionally long before that night. As the court adjourned, Judge Kingsley announced that closing arguments would take place the next morning. The verdict would soon follow. Outside, cameras buzzed. Anchors rehearsed sound bites. Inside, Caleb Whitaker sat frozen in place, staring into the middle distance. For the first time, he looked like a man who didn't know what came next. The courtroom felt like a pressure chamber. 5 days of raw testimony, emotional collisions, damning evidence, and legal duels had led to this moment. The tension was palpable. Every seat was taken, overflow rooms packed with spectators and media, watching on screens with bated breath. Isabel sat flanked by her attorney Jessica Morales and Madeline, who held her hand tightly. Her breathing was calm but deliberate, her eyes distant, almost as if she were hovering above the weight of it all. At the defense table, Caleb sat unnaturally still. The arrogance was gone, so was the steely confidence. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white. Benjamin Klein leaned in to whisper something, but Caleb didn't respond. His gaze was fixed, forward, unblinking, into a future he no longer had control over. The jury filed in, faces solemn, many refusing to meet Caleb's eyes. The foreperson, a composed woman in her 40s, stood with a single sheet trembling slightly in her hand. In the case of the state versus Caleb Whitaker, she began, her voice catching under the enormity of her task, on the charge of felony assault on a pregnant spouse. She inhaled. We find the defendant guilty. The air shifted. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Caleb flinched, his shoulders sinking, as if the word had torn something open inside him. Klein placed a hand on his arm, a silent, grounding touch. Judge Kingsley struck the gavel once. Sentencing will be scheduled in a separate hearing. This court is adjourned. The room came back to life in a rush, murmurs, shuffling, the click of cameras, but Isabel heard none of it. Her vision blurred with tears, a torrent of emotions too vast for language. Relief, justice, pain, closure, grief. She placed a protective hand over her belly, leaning forward slightly. A silent vow passed from her lips to her child. You are safe now. Caleb stayed seated longer than anyone else, unmoving, his expression hollow. As the deputies approached to escort him into custody, he finally turned his head. His eyes met Isabel's across the room. For a long breath, neither looked away. Her stare was calm, resolute. His, disoriented, defeated, and perhaps for a fleeting second, remorseful. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them in that final glance, a quiet acknowledgement that what they once shared had been irreparably broken, shattered by a single act and the trust that could never be rebuilt. Whatever future Caleb had once envisioned, it would no longer include unchecked power, polished reputation, or redemption on his terms. Outside the courthouse, the press surged toward the steps, cameras flashing and microphones raised, but Isabel remained surrounded, protected by Jessica Morales and Madeline Prescott. Sarah Hernandez from Voices United stood quietly nearby, her presence a silent message of solidarity. Isabel tilted her face toward the sky. A break in the clouds allowed a shaft of sunlight to spill through, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she exhaled, truly exhaled, without tension clinging to her chest. She had done something many only dared to dream of. She had stood up to a man with wealth, status, and reach, not for vengeance, but for herself, for her unborn child, for every woman who had ever been told to keep quiet and endure. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, co-parenting, healing, rebuilding, but it would be hers, free from fear. The verdict wasn't just legal justice, it was personal liberation. And so ends the saga of the mogul whose hubris and betrayal brought him to the brink of public ruin. Caleb Whitaker, once considered untouchable, must now face the full consequences of his actions. Hey, our dear friends, are you still here with us, even now? If you are, something in this story must have touched your heart in a quiet, powerful way. And now I invite you to take a step back with me, not to judge, not to blame, but to simply see things as they are. Life doesn't always hand us justice neatly wrapped. Sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones who shake our world to its core. But what if healing begins not in fighting for perfection, but in choosing to stand quietly and firmly for what's right? Isabel's story is not just about trauma, it's about reclaiming dignity. She didn't strike back with hate, she chose strength. Chose truth. As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. And in her silence, in her tears, in her courtroom testimony, Isabel found that strength. Maybe you've been there too, in the shadows. Wondering if your voice matters. It does. Healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, I survived. And sometimes, like today, it simply means saying, no more. So if you felt something tonight, if this story stirred your heart or mirrored something in your life, please like this video, share it, let someone else see what resilience can look like. And subscribe, not just for more stories, but to stay connected with a community that believes in healing, in truth, and in standing up, no matter how long it takes. Thank you for being here, and remember, even in the darkest corners, light finds a way. We'll see you in the next story.